Welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to Our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the American Bar Association Antitrust Law section. My name is Alicia Downey, and the title of today's episode is Who is Alejandra Palacios? Meet the former chair of the Mexican Federal Economic Competition Commission, also known as COFECE. In March 2022, Alejandra was one of 4 current and former competition agency heads, all women, who were featured panelists at the Antitrust Law Section's annual spring meeting in Washington, D.C. There simply wasn't enough time to do these inspiring panelists justice, so by popular demand, we are dedicating an episode of Our Curious Amalgam to each of them. In this episode, we'll ask former Chair Palacios to talk about some of the most newsworthy accomplishments of COFECE under her leadership, as well as her own professional journey. Joining me today is my co-host, Anora Wang. Hi, Anora.
Hi, Alicia.
Anora, would you like to introduce our guest?
Sure. Our guest, Alejandra Palacios, was the first ever woman who have chaired Mexico's competition authority, COFECE, which is short for the Federal Economic Competition Commission of Mexico. Alejandra chaired COFECE for 8 years from 2013 to September 2021, and during her tenure, she also served as a vice president of the ICN, which is the International Competition Network. Alejandra has obtained over 15 years of experience as a public policy expert and a ministry-level government official. And during her 8 years at COFECE, the agency handled several unprecedented antitrust cases, which were very interesting in learning more about. Prior to serving the government, Alejandra also taught economics at ITEM, which is a very good university in Mexico, and she was Deputy Director of Economic Regulation Research at the Mexican Institute of Competitiveness.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alicia, and thank you, Anora. It's a great pleasure to be with you today.
Alejandra, pleasure is all ours. Most of us, I think, who are listening, we're not that familiar with the Mexican competition law. Would you dumb it down a little bit for us and tell us how does it compare perhaps to some other major jurisdictions like the U.S. and the European Commission?
Yes, of course. Well, Mexico adopted its first competition law in 1992. So basically 100 years after the U.S., and in preparation for the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which is now the USMCA, which is the free trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. And as part of this agreement, the 3 signatory states had to have a competition national law. As U.S. companies were entering the Mexican markets, and Mexican markets were highly concentrated, it was needed to have an antitrust agency in Mexico to level the playing field, both for Mexicans and companies coming in from Canada and the U.S. And this is how the agency came about. And Mexico's competition law it's quite broad. It establishes basically all competitions law do establish, which is ex-ante merger control regime. It prohibits and sanctions hardcore cartels, without requiring an assessment of their effects. So it's a per se sanction. And then it also fights vertical agreements and abuse of dominance position when a company has an anti-competitive effect, which is using the rule of law reason. And then there were 2 important reforms after it entered in force in 1994, in 2006 and 2011, with relevant amendments. One, for example, bringing in the leniency program, which we all know is important for cartels. The possibility of doing down rates, which in my tenure were very important in terms of bringing down cartels. They also higher the maximum fines. It also brought in the possibility of criminal prosecution and cartels and the possibility of imposing interim measures. Finally, there was an important constitutional reform in 2013 where the antitrust agency COFECE became an autonomous body from the executive branch, and specialized courts on competition matters were established in our country.
That's very helpful. I think the background about NAFTA and trade with other countries is actually very important to understand. And does it mean that from the very inception, COFECE is an agency that probably works in and outside, with agencies outside of Mexico
Yes.
in terms of cooperation with other agencies?
Yes. So the ICN, which is the International Competition Network, turned 20 years just a few months ago. And COFECE was one of the founding agencies. If my numbers are correct, there have been 8 or 12 agencies who founded the ICN, and the Mexican agency is one of them. Now, the ICN is composed for more than 130 antitrust agencies around the world.
That's also very helpful to know. And you mentioned there were 2 reforms after the reception, I guess the adoption of the competition law and also the establishment of the agency. Does it mean that COFECE has been continuously expanding, I guess, in terms of capacity and enforcement, authority? For instance, how many cases does COFECE take and decide each year now?
Yeah. Well, when you bring in a new legal system into a country, what normally happens is that domestic actors really don't know much about how to implement the law, what the impact of the law is, what the consequences will be. So these reforms that you're mentioning came about because after the early years of practicing antitrust law and a period of trial and error, it was found that COFECE did not have enough tools in order to investigate. So that's why the leniency program was important, and also the down rates, and also that fines were not high enough. So companies would have the incentive, one, to cooperate in investigative cases, and then more broadly, that sanctions would be enough to, make a dissuasive factor in terms of bad conduct.
Deterrence is definitely an important goal, I suppose. And also you mentioned down rates. So I suppose cartel enforcement has always been a focus of COFECE. But does COFECE also have other roles or initiatives, in terms of advocate competition law and providing guidance to businesses? How does the agency work other than, going in, doing all the down rates?
Yes.
And enforce the law?
I think it's very important for antitrust agencies to be transparent, and also to create guidance on how you will apply the law. Maybe the first 2 or 3 years that I was head of the agency, we dedicated a lot of time to create a lot of technical criteria and guidances. And everything regarding how the leniency program works, how are we going to treat, for example, the attorney-client privilege, what do we understand for vertical agreements, how do we treat confidential information. Our merger review was analyzed twice. So all around antitrust enforcement, we created a lot of guidance.
Let's focus on enforcement a little bit. Alejandra, could you tell us some of the most, noteworthy cases that you have handled or the agency has handled while under your leadership?
Yes. One that I find interesting, and basically it was my last one, I guess, has to do with a non-poach agreement. We all know that labor markets and non-poach agreements is something that is being analyzed by the DOJ and the FTC, more by the DOJ. And so in Mexico on September 2021, as an antitrust agency, we sanctioned 12 top-tier football clubs and the Mexican Soccer Federation for 2 things: for imposing salary caps on women's salary, and also for restricting players' movement in that market, which is what we call the domestic player transfer market. So basically, what the teams were doing, they were impeding this transfer and higher prices. They wanted to, they were trying to protect their business and their margins by not permitting players, women and men, have higher salaries.
So, what were the remedies that were ordered in that case?
Well, there were more than remedies. It's an obligation of you have to stop doing what you're doing. It's a cartel sanction. So there were fines equivalent to $7.5 million. And one thing that was interesting that happened while the investigation was ongoing is that the league decided, for example, to replace the salary caps for the women in football. And imagine this, and this is extreme. 20 women players had a maximum cap of $84 per month.
Oh,
Yes, 84.
This U.S. dollars or Mexican dollars?
No, it was
Pesos.
2,000 Mexican pesos. Yes,
regardless, this is
and so that's
unimaginable.
$4 per month. After the salary cap was replaced, and this was while the investigation was ongoing. They knew what we were investigating. Of course, they replaced the salary cap, and the salaries raised to $600 per month.
Let me just ask a follow up, and this is the feminism coming out of me. So, is the new cap for women players still lower than the male players?
Yes, of course, it's lower. I think it's something that happens also in other places, and it's not fair. I'm also there's also my feminist side in this. But what they were saying, what the Mexican league was saying, is that they wanted to make the league function. They wanted the league at that moment that the league would have gainings. So in order to do that, they had to cap the women's salaries. That was their argument. So it's like if a company says that if it wants to have earnings, then it needs to cap the salaries of their employees. So yes, it was a terrible argument. And so we were more of the idea that, the salaries should be decided by the market. And if the business is profitable, it is. And if it isn't, it isn't.
I have one more follow up on this and focusing on no poach a little bit. So, is this one area where Mexico is actually converging with the U.S. right now? The U.S. DOJ has signaled that they're going to treat no poach criminally. Is that something that Mexico is also taking a look at?
So for us, it was always clear, and even before the latest arguments made by the DOJ, that capping salaries or impeding employees their liberty to move from one company to another is a collusion. It's a collusion in the labor market. So you can have collusions, I don't know, in the medicine market or in the car market or in the oil market, and there's also collusion in the labor market. I think this case is interesting for many reasons. One, in my feminist world, because it's pristine in terms of how it's different how they treat men and women. Mm-hmm. And then it's also it was also relevant in terms of positioning the Mexican Antitrust Agency in the agenda, because in Mexico we're football lovers, so everybody, COFECE was all over the news for the first time. And then also it's interesting because it's a labor market, and you're sending a signal that you cannot collude yourselves in the labor market. So, you have this first case, and this case generates jurisprudence.
Well, congratulations on that achievement. I think the Mexican football players are grateful too.
Well, and then answering the question regarding if non-poach agreements could be criminalized. So what the Mexican law says is that any cartel agreement can be analyzed by the national prosecutor as a criminal case. So how this works is that once that COFECE has an investigation, then it can present a complaint to the general prosecutor, and then they'll start a criminal investigation. It's not like in the US where you have the DOJ who also follows up on criminal cases, doing both the administrative and the criminal case. So
Right.
Mexico and the Mexican Antitrust Authority could present a criminal case for collusion or for non-poaching in particular to the national prosecutor.
I think another accomplishment of your agency was winning an award for a paper called A Converging Competition Agenda for the Prosperity of Mexico and the United States. For listeners, we'll post a copy of that paper online, but I wondered, Alejandra, if you would talk a little bit about that paper by the agency and in particular why you felt it was important to generate that sort of work.
Yes. So this is an advocacy effort. And as you say, Alicia, it's a document where we very clearly put how there could be a converging agenda in antitrust matters between Mexico and the US. So this paper came about because there was, in 2021, what I thought is a surprising announcement from President Biden, publishing an executive order on promotion of competition in the American economy, and that's how he called it. What he does in that document is that he recognizes the benefit of competition, recognizes that the American economy has been concentrating, but for an antitrust agency, what I think is the most relevant part of this executive order is that it recognizes that there is a need for an integral competition policy in order to create competitive markets. And so you need, of course, the antitrust agency. It's a necessary part of that puzzle. But then there's also diverse government agencies, sectoral regulators, we call them, that also have an impact on how markets work. And so, according to this executive order, government agencies, apart from FTC and DOJ, need to identify and modify or eliminate unnecessary regulations that pose barriers to market entry in several markets in the US, like the pharmaceutical market or the airline industry in terms of how you regulate slots, or the freight industry, etc. And what we had done at the Antitrust Agency in Mexico with our advocacy documents exactly was identifying unnecessary regulations and barriers imposed by other Mexican regulatory agencies that, in our case, needed to be eliminated in order to create competitive markets in Mexico. And so we analyzed our proposals, and then we analyzed the executive US proposals. And then at the end of the day, what is really interesting is that in both cases, we had the same markets analyzed, and regulatory barriers that they found in the US were the same that we also found in Mexico. So it's like sectoral regulators sort of do the same things, and then agencies advocate for other things. So that's why the agenda is converging.
Very good. Could we just ask, we promised the listeners we would talk to you about a little bit about your professional journey. This was the focus of the luncheon panel at the spring meeting, and it was very interesting to hear. What have you been doing since stepping down from the commission?
I've been doing several things. So I took a little bit of time off. I mean, I was head of the Antitrust Agency for 8 years, and I was really tired.
I can imagine.
I hadn't noticed until I started resting. And then when I started resting, I knew I needed some more rest. But then apart from that, I've joined the Brattle Group as an affiliate expert for antitrust matters. And so I'll be working with them on a case-by-case scenario. And then also I moved to the US because of family matters. So I'm a senior fellow at the Price School which is the government school at the University of Southern California. And then also, I am just last week, I decided I would accept an invitation to be an independent member of a company. It's the biggest Mexican airport company, and it's a company that is listed both in Mexico and in the United States stock exchange. So I think maybe I'll do a little bit of boards, bringing about my experience from being in government and analyzing antitrust matters. And then finally, and this is, I love this, I've been taking some time to study. So I've decided that there's certain things that are happening and that I did not quite understand, and that they're going to be trends. And I want to understand how those trends affect markets. So I did a course on blockchain. I mean, it was very difficult to understand, but it was challenging and wonderful. And right now I'm doing a course on ESG. It's called Capitalism and ESG. And then after I finish that, I'm doing a course on artificial intelligence. They're trends, and they're going to affect how markets work. So I want to understand how they work. So then when I go back to the regulatory or policy space, I understand, what's in back of those issues.
So, going back to the beginning, what made you interested in competition law?
I'm very passionate about antitrust, and I think I've always been very passionate about antitrust because there's this component of fairness and making a more equal society, which is what gave birth to antitrust in the first place. That making markets work for the people, which is, I guess, one of my core values, or working on that, one of my purposes in life. I mean, if I get fundamental. So it's those values with technical knowledge combined that makes antitrust for me so extraordinary.
I think a lot of us practitioners feel the same way. Now, in the course of your career, have you ever encountered gender discrimination? And if so, what was some good advice you received for dealing with that?
The best advice I received it from a senator, and it was the day they named me chair of the antitrust agency. So they created COFECE, and within COFECE, they named the 7 board members of the agency. And one of those members had to be named chair. So 7 of us came into the agency. We were board members. And then the Senate had to choose the chair of one of those 7. And don't ask me why they chose me. But I was a woman, and I was much younger than my colleague commissioners. They were around their 60s, and I was less than 40. I was 38. So it was like a huge thing, no? How did they choose them and not these other guys who are men who are experimented? No, they're in their 60s, blah blah blah. So then the head of the Senate at that moment, when he saw their faces and my face, came to me and said, we chose you for a reason, and I know you have what it takes to chair the agency. Nobody knows that, but you do have it. So what you have to do is you need to go to the meeting, and then you need to sit down and you need to show them that you're the boss. And maybe like for the first month, you won't exactly understand what is happening. But really what is most important of all is that everybody knows that you're the boss. And in order for everybody to know that you're the boss, you need to be convinced that you are the boss. So go and do that.
Very, very good advice.
Yes.
Now, switching gears as we sort of head to the end of the program, we're going to ask you a question we ask every Our Curious Amalgam guest, because we're curious to know, what is something interesting about yourself that's outside of your professional life?
I would say that, in my professional life, I am viewed as an antitrust expert. But I would say that my real expertise is problem solving. I love it when I have in front of me a complex issue at hand and I need to understand it in order to tackle it. I even feel adrenaline. I remember when I was young, for example, that I needed to go out to a party or something, I had a date and I had also a math problem that I needed to solve. So I would go out, I would party, have a drink, and then come back. And instead of going back to bed, I would say all night trying to solve the problem. And I get so embedded when I'm trying to solve a problem, so concentrated that I really disconnect of what is happening, no? And I've really resolved very difficult issues along my life. And then I've also lost planes, lost friends, lost phones and credit cards and purses and everything because I've so concentrated in something that I absolutely lose track of everything else.
Well, it's a great quality for somebody who's solving difficult technical problems that are presented by antitrust and competition issues. I think I want to move now to our final segment. It's a little game we play. We call it the Curious Hat, but in your case, we're going to call it El Sombrero Curioso.
Okay.
And now it's time for the Curious Hat.
The rules of the game are very simple. All you need to do is pick a number between 1 and 10.
9.
Okay, question number 9. If you could choose free front row tickets for any performing arts show or festival in the world, what would you choose?
Free first line tickets. If the Beatles were alive, I would choose to go to a Beatles concert.
Oh, that's a great fantasy. Well, thank you so much for being our guest today. It was a great conversation.
Thank you, Alicia and Anora. It's always a pleasure speaking with you guys and with the American Bar Association.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.